I was the one who signed the papers in Brasilia for BRICS. The G in G20, as I'm sure your listeners now know, stands for government.
How do you see Africa's role in evolving in these conversations?
In having employment policies that are very friendly to youth.
What would you then say would be the big threat?
For me, the biggest threat to ourselves, it does not take away jobs. It actually enhances jobs. People were calling a train wreck. No, people must be in the office from this time to that time, and it tags everybody. And then the next thing, before you know, you've got hundreds and hundreds of thousands and millions of people working with you. Those are things that are critical for us to deal with.
Mr. Tumi Daba, welcome to the Creative One, a special edition of the G20 Behind the Curtain, and that's what we call this series of recordings that we do, and we talk to different people that have been involved in different parts of the world around the G20. And in this episode, we're going inside the G20's human capital agenda with yourself. And I'm going to actually leave it up to you as I welcome you to tell us a bit about yourself. How are you doing this afternoon?
Well, thank you, first of all, for inviting me for your one of your interviews. I'm doing great, having a very good afternoon. I have a long relationship with the G20 and the B20. I think it's important to mention the B20 because I've always been a business person. And so my entree into the G20 has always been through the business window and business doors, right? The relationship goes as far back as 2009, I think, 2008, 2009, when we had what was called the global financial crisis. And you will recall at the time, I was already at the ILO, International Labour Organization. The ILO, for those who have not followed, what it does is what I always refer as the mother of the workplace. So everything you can think about that has anything to do with work, any rule, any recommendation, any resolution comes from the ILO. It is a part of the United Nations family. But it is also important that for context, it is understood it is older than the United Nations because it was born in 1919, and the United Nations was born in 1945. So my involvement with the G20 was via the ILO, really, because when we had the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, the ILO was mandated to have what was called a global jobs pact, to talk about how in the future we would be approaching the world of work without being imposed upon by the financial markets and by the finance ministers, because you will recall that the global financial crisis happened because of the financial derivative markets. At the time, it started actually in California back in the day. So the ILO was brought in to say we need labor ministers and people who are in the human capital development environment and who are human-centric to come in. So I hope that helps as a background and as a context.
100% no, it does. Perhaps what will also just help in putting some context is just the differentiation, just for the purpose of our audiences, between G20 and B20.
Okay. So the G in G20, as I'm sure your listeners now know, stands for government.
Yep.
It's government 20. But every G20 since it started, including now when South Africa is hosting the G20, has a B that stands for business, and has an L that stands for labor. In some, depending on the country that is hosting, there will also be an emphasis on the Y, which stands for youth. There'll also be sometimes a T that stands for think tank, and so on and so on.
I see. Yeah, which is interesting because I think in our next episode we're going to be chatting to somebody around youth. I'm sure that's where the youth Y20 would obviously be relevant. But you were deeply involved in shaping employment, I guess, based on what you just said, employment and education policy, right, across G20 presidencies. And you can perhaps also clarify which G20 presidencies exactly. I know from Seoul to Rome. You can just tell us which ones you were involved in and what the key themes or shifts you witnessed in your involvement.
Well, my involvement in the G20, as I said, started quite early, around 2008, 2009. As I recall, the first G20 I got involved in, I think, was hosted by the French. And certainly the business entity that was responsible for that would have been MEDEF, who are based in Paris, in France. And MEDEF would be the equivalent, for example, of BUSA in South Africa, for those of you who know about Business Unit in South Africa. So the equivalent of BUSA with the French is MEDEF. I then was part of really most of the G20s. Even if I did not attend physically, I attended online throughout the years. And then when we had the G20 in China, I was very intricately involved, in fact, in it, and attended that one physically. When we had the G20 in Germany, I was involved. I was actually part of the task team that deals with employment and education. Yeah. When we had the one in Italy, again, I was co-chairing the task team on education and employment. And so I exited the G20 space, B20 space in 2021, when I left my role as the leader of all the employers in the world in the ILO, because I was also the first African to become the vice president of the International Organization of Employers. Now, the International Organization of Employers is like the BUSA of the world, if I were to put it like that. So you have BUSA in South Africa. Yep. BUSA would be a member of that, one of the 150 business organizations that are member of the IOE. I became the vice president of the IOE. But by virtue of becoming the vice president of the IOE, I also became the vice chairman of the International Labour Organization globally. And the shifts that you see, as I said earlier, Peter, are really determined by the host country mostly. So what you find is that the host country will decide what particular areas are relevant to itself, or relevant to its citizens, or relevant to how it wants to build its policies as it moves forward.
See, and as the B20 task force, I think that's what you said, your involvement in that, as well as ILO appointee, how did business voices influence global labor policy, and where did you see perhaps frictions or alignment with government agendas?
So in South Africa, for example, there wasn't any active participation in the G20, B20 aspect. The business part, BUSA, I used to represent South Africa, I think just by default, because I was in the ILO and I knew that things are happening every year in the different countries. I would report back, of course, to BUSA. I would seek a mandate from BUSA. But there was never any active participation until I actually pushed very hard, probably around 2017, 2018. I started lobbying people like Martin Kingston and trying to show them why it is important for BUSA and for South Africa to be part of the proceedings of the B20, G20, as it leads up, for example, to South Africa now, because as you know, annually it changes the hosting. Now, the biggest changes that I saw from from the policy influencing point of view would be from things like Uber. You know, if you remember, in about, I can't remember now the years, unfortunately, Peter, but when Uber came into prominence and started operating, people started talking about digital platforms, you know, and the gig economy, and how digital platforms were going to influence the gig economy, how its prominence would affect employer relations, how it would possibly affect the working people, because you will probably know that for many years, technology has always been seen as a big threat to jobs, always been seen as a big threat to sustainability of jobs and the dignity that jobs bring, especially when you go into the developed world and the developing world divide. Now, there came a concept called Uberization when Uber came. Everybody was talking about Uberization, how Uber is going to influence the working environment in such a way that it takes over business as we know it. For me, that was probably one of the biggest shifts I can think of, certainly before you got to the issue that came with artificial intelligence, and certainly before you got to the COVID, because the COVID also affected the working environment and how we perceive work. For example, these would be topics that would be taken to the G20 and the B20 and the L20 to be discussed, what the impact would be. In the ILO, for example, in 2019, had to celebrate its centenary, 100 years of the ILO's existence. Now, what happens is that affects the program in the G20. It affects the program in BRICS, for example, as well. It affects the content that is going to be discussed, because the ILO has always tended to be sort of the center of everything that has to do with policies, especially as they relate to work. Of course, insofar as it relates to just technology, and it relates to finance, it relates to innovation, it relates to entrepreneurship, the ILO would not be part of that. But a lot of task teams would also be influenced in the different sessions they have by what happens in the world of work. Now, the COVID, why I mentioned the COVID, and how it affected the content as well of not only the ILO, but also the G20 program, was that the COVID for the first time forced everybody to work away from the physical bricks and mortar environment, right? For the first time, we had to face some challenges we've had in the past, or rather I would say stereotypes, where people would say, yeah, you can't have remote work, and no, people must be in the office from this time to that time. And all of a sudden, that bandage was ripped off. You couldn't make a decision that is based on saying, no, people mustn't work from home, because they could only work from home. And you had a situation where remote work became a very big buzzword. Collaboration became a very big buzzword during the COVID. And somehow it found a way to intersect with the evolution of artificial intelligence, because that was also happening. We're already talking about the future of work. 2019, when we had the centenary celebration, one of the main conversations in the ILO and the whole world as a result was the future of work. We came up with an ILO declaration on the future of work in 2019, and you'll remember that then the COVID followed soon thereafter. And what was very interesting in the G20, and all the leaders of the world confirmed that the ILO declaration on the future of work that was done in 2019, although it never could have foreseen the possibility of a COVID that would affect the whole world, but it definitely was the right document to deal with what people were calling a train wreck in the world of work because of the COVID. And it definitely was the right instrument to deal with resilience in the world of work, to deal with sustainability in the world of work, and for all of us to continue having dignity.
And talking about Uberization, and I know you mentioned COVID, and COVID is now gone. With the G20 now coming into South Africa, what would you then say would be the big threat is in as far as labor is concerned in South Africa, as G20 is going to be hosted in the country?
Well, Peter, I think that if you watch the evolution of how the world of work has matured and how it's been affected by a lot of factors that I believe we should proactively have looked into, like technology, for example, which, contrary to general belief, does not take away jobs. It actually enhances jobs. But our failure to intervene at a human level and our failure to intervene at a skills development and a knowledge transfer level and have interventions ends up giving technology that a possibility of taking away jobs. Now, for me, the biggest threat to ourselves is labor itself, in my view, the trade unions, the L part of the G20, because I find that labor, or rather the trade unions, have not managed to get a grip on how things are now working in the world of work. You know, there was a time when if you had a trade union, the trade union was meant to be all things to people who have no representation about their rights, all things to people who did not know what their rights were, all things to people who sought redress, who sought assistance in terms of miscarriage of justice, in terms of social justice challenges and so on. But you know, when you move forward now, having AI, having the future of work, having social media, having TikTok, having Twitter, having all these platforms, people are now looking for immediate resolution of their challenges. And if they cannot get it from a trade union that might take months to deal with it, they simply go on X, what we used to call Twitter. Say something and everybody comes and tags everybody. And then the next thing, before you know, you've got hundreds and hundreds of thousands and millions of people working with you to pressurize whoever it is that is having a miscarriage of justice targeted your way. So for me, it is our lack of response, or rather the lack of being proactive to the challenges of how technology is growing at a very rapid rate, at how we have, for example, let's take South Africa. South Africa, believe it or not, is still a country that does not have an employment policy. So we have a very good Labor Relations Act that is based again on the ILO. It's founded on the conventions on the ILO. But for me, it is a huge, huge challenge when a country like ours that has huge elements of underdevelopment, huge elements of informality, which is a huge opportunity for the growth of our country, because informality makes up over 60% of what we do in this country. But without an employment policy and without an appreciation of what skills we have and what skills we don't have, without an appreciation of what must we import from others, and so on, without an appreciation of how do we collaborate with our African brothers and African sisters, without making sure that we get rid of this very stringent and obstructive visa regulations, for example, amongst ourselves as Africans. You know, just like Namibia has done. Namibia, I'm understanding, is blocking some of the people from the outside world from just coming in without visas, but is opening up to us who are Africans, right? There are other countries who are doing likewise. I'm told I'm trying to think now where Traore comes from. Remind me the country, Traore's country. Burkina Faso.
Burkina Faso, yes.
Yes, countries like Burkina Faso are opening up to all of us as Africans. Do not have to apply for visas and do all these things. We can work together. This is what we need to do within the G20 as a platform. South Africa is a member. Other African countries have applied to be members, but they can't. They just come as observers, right? Because it's limited to the 20. So we have to find a way as Africans of working together as a bloc and making sure that we are able to deal with issues that pertain to us as a developing continent, for example, because people like in Latin America, the Latin America is very good as a developing region at working together. So we need to emulate that and use platforms like the G20, of course, the BRICS Plus as well, and so on, to be able to push our being very proactive in dealing with our issues of policy, our being very proactive in having employment policies that are very friendly to youth, that are very friendly to entrepreneurship, very friendly to innovation, that are not threatened by young people wanting to do things, not threatened by young people want to lead in doing the things that we need to be done, and creating a space for young people and innovation.
So when talking about that, so when Uberization happened, which country was affected by that, and where that conversation was held, and how they addressed that, if that was part of the conversations?
Well, as I said, Peter, I'm just trying to remember. I don't want to come up with a year and then I'm wrong as to when we actually placed it on the agenda. Uberization became an agenda item.
Digital innovation, yeah.
Yeah, it could have been as far back as 2014, 2015, maybe even earlier. But you remember, Uber started affecting the majority of the developed world. You had Uber in the UK, you had Uber, it comes from the US. Obviously, the US would have Uber. You had Uber coming into Germany, Uber coming into Switzerland, Uber coming into France. I remember going to meetings actually of the G20 using Uber in some parts. And then there was a big problem in how on the digital platform it dealt with the rights of workers, because, you know, there is this argument that still rages till today. Do e-hailing companies like Uber and Bolt actually give equality on those platforms as they would like people to believe? Do people who are drivers have the same power as Uber or Bolt as the companies, for example? You've had countries that have banned Uber and some that have pushed through legislation to have mobilization of trade unions for certain rights to be given to drivers, so that drivers, for instance, can have insurance and can have protection in the job. I mean, now let's go back to the COVID, for example, as an example of Uberization. You will probably be aware that the biggest problem we had in some of our countries was, how do we get to what we call informal workers when we want to assist them, you know, with funds for their families and things like that? You will recall that Uber, even though drivers and Uber are supposed to be equal partners, we could not get the Uber drivers, over 20,000 of them, to be funded and supported by the Unemployment Insurance Fund, because there was a claim that they can't be found. You don't know how to identify them, right? Now, if they were equal partners with Uber, surely when you identify who Uber is and you identify who Bolt is, you'll be able to identify all the drivers on that platform, right? Correct. So from an Uberization point of view, or an e-hailing point of view now as it is, you have a serious situation of still not having dealt with the fact that drivers argue very strongly they are over-exploited, not just exploited, but exploited by entities like Uber and Bolt, who take 25 to 30% of what they make, irrespective as to whether the economy is good or not, irrespective as to whether the petrol goes up or not, irrespective as to whether they increase their prices or not, and it just stays like that. So you still have those kind of challenges. And in some ways, it ends up making digital platforms and technology a bad thing, but they are not a bad thing. The problem is the lack of proper intervention by governments. The problem is the lack of proper policy drafting and implementation by governments. And these are the things we should be dealing with. And of course, I think I don't want to say we deal with these things without also paying a particular attention to issues of the environment. I mean, that's the other thing that's very big these days, is how do you deal with the things we deal with, whilst at the same time trying to minimize your carbon footprint in everything we do, okay? So if we go back to that very example of cars and transport and Uber, is when you have all these cars that are being introduced into our environments, how do we make sure that we minimize the carbon footprint? How do we make sure that a company like Uber, a company like Bolt, contributes to our fiscus, contributes to our taxes based on how much carbon footprint it has and how much in terms of the environment it contributes to challenges we might have.
So now I'm going to take us just slightly back to your involvement in various countries. You mentioned Germany as one. If you can take us inside of some of the high stake moments, perhaps in Germany or in Italy, where a breakthrough or a breakdown changed the course of the recommendations.
Okay, so Germany was pre-COVID. So you'll see that I keep going to COVID because COVID changed a lot in the way we see the world and in the world of work, right? Especially in terms of remote working. And then Italy was post COVID, or was actually during and as it ends.
Held online.
Sorry?
Was it held online?
No, some of us were still forced to travel physically. So I still went to Italy, and even though I refused to have vaccination, I never vaccinated. I refused to vaccinate because I said I will not be a guinea pig for anybody. But you had to have that thing stuck up your nose. Do you remember? So every 72 hours, I'd have to have something stuck up my nose if I crossed the border from Geneva into Italy. And so on and backwards. But now going back to your question. So in Germany, for example, as I recall, Uberization was still a very big issue. Issues of the digital platforms were still a very big issue. Issues of SMEs, small, medium enterprises, was a very big issue. And we're still talking about issues of access and issues of access to finance, issues of access to resources. And I do recall that in terms of the conversations we were having, some of us were clear in saying, rather than be threatened by technology and be threatened by things like that we label as Uberization, we need to take responsibility and accountability of our failures as the players, the B, the L, and the G. Okay, so that would be business, labor. Even civil society. We are failing our people, and we can't be trying to tame technology and say technology is going to be controlled because you can't do that. Technology is going to happen whether you like it or not. But what we need to do, and I think where people started to realize that we need to change our behavior and our attitudes, was somewhere when we were in Germany, where we were talking, we were actually in Bad Neuenahr. I even remember now where we were. The town was called Bad Neuenahr, where we were talking about how do we as people actually accept that disruption is not necessarily wrong for growth, and disruption is not necessarily wrong for sustainability, and diversity is required in every aspect, and trying to also ensure that people know that we have to have a difference between how we treat the developing world and the developed world. And so inside the room, we're having very heated conversations like that, that say that let's stop scapegoating. Let's stop making excuses. Let's stop pointing fingers at other people and point fingers at ourselves to see how we could actually improve the things we do outside the room of the G20. The other problem that the G20 has always had, and that even this year, I think is still a challenge, is that you have a challenge, Peter, where there's a lot of rhetoric, right? You will remember that I mentioned to you that the host sort of determines the content of the conversation, determines emphasis, right? So you go to Germany and you talk about SMEs, for example. You then go to the next country and the next country says, we don't have a problem with SMEs, we have a problem with climate, right? And the environment. So which means then the topic on SMEs is dropped. So there's no continuity from one country to the next. There's also not forcing the country that was doing the SMEs to be accountable as it hands over to the country now that is going to do issues on the climate and the environment. So for me, the issues of continuity have always been an issue inside the room, right? And when we got to Italy, the issue of continuity post-COVID was still an issue. Of course, in Italy, people were, all they could talk about is health and the World Health Organization, how we are to relate to each other, and how remote work now all of a sudden was taking center stage, and also the things that were happening inside the room, Peter, were a realization that the structures that we've had in building our economy pre-COVID were flawed. Because when you talk about people being separated, for example, and you say people must observe a particular distance between themselves, how do you do that in a developing world? How do you do that in a squatter camp? How do you do that in a little hut? How do you do that? And if that's the only way you are going to be able to prevent COVID getting worse as a disease, then surely that can't be the best way of doing it in countries that where people are in close proximity to each other. They don't have mansions where we can sit in different rooms in the same house kind of thing. And people would say we need bottled water and clean water. How do you do it in a developing world where the infrastructure is not of such a nature as to have the clean water and the bottled water we are talking about, right? So we're starting now to say the workplace as we know it has to change, and the developed people, people from the developed countries have to collaborate with the people in the developing countries. You'll remember there was an issue, for example, on whether the developing countries would have the vaccinations or not, irrespective of the fact that some of us did not want vaccinations. But you're right as an individual. If you want vaccination, you should have it, right?
Yes,
but
correct.
But you'll remember there was a huge challenge and huge uproar, with the sense that the people who were doing and developing these vaccinations in the US and in Europe were refusing to give us these until they had dealt with their own people. So it meant we can die here once they continue to live there, right? Now for me, those kind of issues of what I would refer to in diplomatic speak, in the multilateral environment, will normally say that people talk from both sides of the mouth. But talking from both sides of the mouth basically refers to the fact that people tend to be, what's the word I'm looking for now, Peter? You know, this word escapes me. When people say one thing but mean another, what do we call it, by the way, in good English?
Not contradictory.
Hypocrisy.
Hypocrisy, yes.
Exactly. So that also has been beginning to increase the temperature in the rooms of the G20. To say, no, we say we're working together, we say we are equal, but actually we don't deal with each other equally. We don't deal with each other with the same level of respect, and so on and so on. And of course, that's where people, even in terms of the environment and in terms of the climate, people that come from the islands, for example, like the Maldives and the Caribbean, are starting to increase the heat to say, sorry, the reason we have the problem that our countries are more in trouble than yours is because you came to our countries and did things in our countries that increased the carbon footprint to a level where no matter what we do now, we can't reverse the clock, right? So you who came here from the developed world owe it to us to help us and make sure that we've got ways of making reparations and remedying the situation.
With how things have now evolved post-COVID, is there continuation with respect to labor as far as the conversations that are taking place, given what the theme is, G20 South Africa?
Well, I think Peter, yes and no. You know the thing about human beings, about all of us, is that when there was a global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, we all said, God, we must work together. The whole world must work together. We must make sure that we rein in the financial markets, the derivative markets that caused the financial crisis, right? You'll remember that countries like South Africa, for example, lost a lot of jobs due to the financial crisis, right? Then fast forward to the COVID. The COVID comes how many years later? 10 years, 11 years later, and everybody says, my God, we need to collaborate. We need to work together. We need to go back to the drawing board. We need to make sure that we level the playing fields. We need to make sure that globalization is treated in an equitous manner, right? But the reality of life is that as soon as you don't have calamity, as soon as you don't have desperation, people tend to go back to their old ways of doing things, right? I don't believe that we have the agency we should be having, Peter, even with the themes we have now, to deal with the issues, for example, of how do we have a country like ours having 60 to 65% informality, but we still work on old concepts that were developed by the ILO of saying, if you are in the informal sector, we must transition you to the formal sector. What does that mean? How do you transition somebody from the informal sector to the formal sector? And do they even want to? Or are you simply just patronizing them because you can, right? If you look at a country like India, let's say, India is 90 to 95% informal. How do you transition 90 to 95% to 5 to 10%? If you look at a country like Nigeria, 90 to 95% informal. How do you transition 90 to 95% to 5%? So it's time we found a way of being, the disruption we're talking about when it got heated in the room in the G20s of the past, of yesteryear, needs to happen now to say, sorry, guys, we need to change these things on their head. We need to find a different way of looking at these things. Maybe it's time we let the people who know about informality and who have the highest levels of informality being the ones who come up with policies that deal with issues of informality, not countries that are Eurocentric or Americans that have nothing to do, with informality, right? And so on and so on. And so for me, those are things that are critical for us to deal with. Or for argument's sake, here's something else that South Africa should be dealing with as part of its theme and finding a way to deal with this, is that we have, Peter, lots of DFIs, as you know, in South Africa, your development finance institutions, right? You got your PIC, you got your IDC, you got your NEF, and so on and so on. Do you know that these entities always fund later? They wait for other people to fund first. They wait for people who have collateral, to come to the party. But as DFIs in a developmental state, we need to be having those DFIs being the funders of first resort. Those are the subtopics we need to be dealing with as a way of ensuring a sustainable environment that has jobs in abundance, that has enterprises that are successful in abundance, that has entrepreneurs in abundance, that has innovators in abundance, and that ensures that we have dignity for our people.
And I think that brings me to the last question that I have, which is, given your global role and deep African roots, of course, how do you see, and I know you touched on the employment policy and what it would do, not only for South Africa, but for intercontinental trade within the continent, right? How do you see Africa's role in evolving in these conversations, especially in skills, education, as well as youth employment?
I see Africa's role in an aligned collaborationist way. You heard me mention visas, for example. We need to work a lot closer in making sure that we do not prohibit each other from coming in as brothers and sisters into each other's territories. We need to work very closely with the Africa Free Trade Agreement guys, the AfTA, right? We need to work very closely with them. We need to ensure that as Africans, we're in charge of our narrative, Peter. We need to have more confidence in who we are. We need to understand that the people who colonized us, the people who made us think that speaking good English as I'm speaking to you, rather than speaking our own languages, that those people were not doing it for us, they were doing it for themselves, right? Yes, it's helpful that now we can speak with everybody in the world, but our self-determination as a people, our confidence as a people, it is steeped in making sure that we speak our own languages, we speak our own culture as we do trade with each other and do lots of trade with each other.
Fantastic. I'd like to thank you so much for joining me this afternoon, Mr. Daba. And your work is, it's quite rich, having been involved in G20 in different levels from 2008-9, as you said, up until 2021. So well done to you.
I don't want to miss this opportunity of saying I've written a book on the ILO, demystifying the jewel called the ILO, a labor of love. It's the only one of its kind in 187 countries. And, you know, if people go onto my Twitter page at Tizoro1, or go onto my TikTok page, mtunzi.mdwaba, or my LinkedIn page, you can find ways of getting hold of it, because I think it can be helpful as well. Thank you.
What's the title of the book?
Demystifying the jewel called the ILO, a labor of love. It's a small 50-something page book. It's meant to be read over 5 hours as you sit, have coffee, and it explains it simply what this is supposed to be. It mentions the G20, it mentions BRICS, it mentions all the places I've been, because I was also the person who signed BRICS. Your colleague was fascinated when I said there was no F in BRICS. She said, yes, actually, when she was in school, it was BRIC. I said, well, I was the one who signed the papers in Brasilia for BRICS when I was in Brazil for South Africa to move from IPSA into BRICS. So all here as well. And
it's, as you said, the labor of love. What a nice place to leave it. Lovely place to leave it. Thank you once again for joining me.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Cheers.